At one point in my career, I had worked in management consulting for a little bit of time. And I didn't do it for a long time, but it was incredibly informative. And it was one of the things that made me say, I can potentially really have unique, great impact if I can go into organizations that have this real challenge and help them move past that moment.
Welcome to this week's As Unexpected podcast, when we talk to C-suite executives, entrepreneurs, and philanthropists about how they lead into the future when the future generally goes as unexpected. I'm Scott Marshall, your host, and my own professional experience has made me a believer that it's not how you show up when all goes as planned, but it is how you show up when things go as unplanned. Given all of their experiences, each of our guests has become very attuned to the fact that the future is not to be predicted. My hope is that this podcast can help all of you become better leaders by building the core leadership capabilities for leading in an uncertain world. Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of the As Unexpected podcast. I'm your host, Scott Marshall, and my guest today is Charon Darris, who I met for the first time over coffee in New York City about a year ago, and I'm so excited to have him on the podcast today. Welcome, Charon.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Charon, I'd love for our listeners to get a sense of you. Can you please share your professional background, which is really phenomenal, the transitions you've made, and your current work?
Sure. Happy to do that. So I studied finance in undergrad at Morehouse College. And when I graduated, I worked in financial services. And I did that for about a 15-year period. I started from being an analyst at JP Morgan Chase, eventually working up and becoming a vice president and doing business development work. And I was pretty good at it, was a top performer in many of the places that I worked. But at the same time I was doing all of that, I always had this interest in doing work that had real social value and impact. We'll talk about this I'm sure a little bit later, but my parents were modest. We had a modest background. They were working class, but they were big believers in education and how it was transformative. And so the first couple of years that I was out of undergrad, I wound up mentoring and tutoring locally in Harlem. As I was progressing in my career in financial services, I wound up serving on boards and doing consulting and fundraising pro bono. And after a 15-year period, I had made a decision that I really wanted to do work that helped others. I wanted that to be my full-time job. And so, at this point, about 12, 13 years ago, I made a decision to go back to school. I was still working full-time. I did an executive MBA at Columbia Business School, focused on nonprofit management. I then did an education policy degree at Harvard. And now, for the last 10 plus years, I've worked in the education space, both on the West Coast and the East Coast, really trying to help organizations move through really challenging times. And I love my work. It's super impactful, and I get to bring together all these skills from all these different jobs I've had across my career.
Thank you for sharing. That's an awesome background. You built the financial skills, which, of course, in any kind of practice of leadership is so important, whether you're in the nonprofit or for-profit sectors. Can you describe for our audience your current role?
Yes. So I am the executive director of a Harlem literacy youth organization called the Reading Team. And so, in short, we help children pre-K through fifth grade learn how to read. We run two programs. One is an after-school program for kindergarten through fifth grade, and the other is a daytime program for pre-K students.
Love it. There's so many facets of it that are just incredible. The one that comes to mind immediately is in a world where we seem to be overwhelmed with the scroll and the swipe and concerns around short attention spans. You are building a skill set around picking up a book and truly reading page by page, which
Yes.
I think has profound implications, not just for the children you're served, but the individuals that they will end up serving. So
Very true.
Thank you for sharing that, and thanks for your commitment to that work. So, of course, the title of this podcast is pretty clear: As Unexpected. I'm a firm believer that anybody who's in the practice of leadership, anybody taking on positions like you have, will confront situations that don't go as planned. And then we have to figure out how we show up for ourselves and how we show up for our teams. Can you please share with our audience some stories of your own professional experience, whether it's more contemporaneous or historical, how something did in fact go as unexpected, and how you showed up for yourself and for those around you, and the impact of how you showed up?
Sure. Happy to do that. I'll just provide a little bit of context, by the way. At one point in my career, I had worked in management consulting for a little bit of time. And, I didn't do it for a long time, but it was incredibly informative. And it was one of the things that made me say, I can potentially really have unique, great impact if I can go into organizations that have this real challenge and help them move past that moment. And, part of that is really informed with, personal experiences that I've had certainly earlier in my career. Just to take a step back, I graduated college in 98. I came out right after what was known as the dot-com, or right before the dot-com bubble burst. And so I did pretty well. People were skipping going to grad school. They were going to startups and making all this money. And I think I was working at a consulting firm. I was working at Deloitte at that time. And right the summer of 2000, the market collapsed. I wound up being let go. I got a nice package. But I was unemployed for a little over a year. And it was demoralizing. It really was.
And unexpected, I'm sure. Unexpected.
Exactly. My folks were very much hardworking people. My mom worked for the city. My father was a cab driver. In my family, everybody worked. There was no excuse to not work. And I struggled for a year and felt actually really shameful that I didn't have a job for a year. I eventually wound up going back to financial services. I worked at JP Morgan Chase again. But it was incredibly humbling. I wound up taking on, a junior role, and it didn't pay a lot of money. In fact, it was probably costing me more money based on where it was. But it wound up, that particular job wound up giving me these really great skills and experience that informed a lot of the other work that I did down the road. And I think, again, the process of, taking a step back, learning a little bit of humility was just really informative for how I lead and how I manage and how I look at people.
That's a great example. Thank you for sharing that. It has a lot of personal and professional elements in there. And when we bring our whole person to these conversations, it has the most impact on our listeners. So there's a couple of things that I wanted to follow up. First of all, that humility combined with confidence. Again, we've met in person. We had a great conversation in the Big Apple. I can tell by the way you're showing up here that you bring that element that combines confidence and humility. And I have my own way to describe that, but I'd love to hear how you think about that, because people would describe them as a paradox. But in fact, the way you're showing up and the way I experience you is that it's not a paradox. It's something that you show up authentically with both all the time.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could respond to that in terms of how confidence and humility are almost complementary to each other.
Sure, sure. You know, I have a slightly different perspective on it, which is that I think with age, there's a lot you just gain a lot of insight. That is what wisdom is, right? And so, was I like this at 25? Probably not. But I have lived enough at this point. I mean, I'm almost 50 now. I've lived enough that I've seen a lot, and I've also accomplished a lot in my career. So, I know what I know. I don't feel that I have to prove anything at this stage, but I also know what it's like to struggle. I if you were to come to my office, in my office, pretty much for any job that I've had in the nonprofit space, I have something on the wall. It's basically my high school grades and my college grades. And I've talked about this in other spaces. I was not a strong student. I was kind of a C plus B student. I always struggled. It didn't come to me easily. I worked really hard and I got through it. But that was one of the early things that was really defining for me. And so now, all these years later, I still remember what that is. I I spend a lot of time thinking about particularly staff who are on my team. You know, I think about what is it that they're going through. Where are they in their life? I take all of that into consideration in my managerial style. And so, I think when people have that type of holistic approach and care with their people, it really creates strong bonds. And particularly if you work in the nonprofit space in education, such as yourself, that is what moves people more than anything. I mean, people don't come into this work to make money. They're not going to make great money. But the mission and knowing that you've got a team member who cares about you, that's what moves the needle to get the work done.
Gosh, there's so much that comes up from that. First of all, you clearly have come to that wisdom that embraces compassion as well. That you can have the confidence, the courage to lead as you do, and show up for those around you, understanding their place, starting with the other, really understanding how they're showing up and the reasons they're showing up in the way they are, and having to make difficult decisions in the midst of that. In my own practice of leadership, I think a lot about how courage and compassion have to coexist with each other. That is, you have to be able to make hard decisions. And sometimes that impacts the people around you, your peers, your colleagues, and so forth. And you have to show up with care for others, understanding their place, understanding the impact of your decisions on them. And it sounds like currently, you've talked many times about your own skill set around turnarounds and how you probably have to bring both of those characteristics with you, those leadership traits, courage and compassion. Can you talk to our audience about how you try to balance those two as you show up with your team?
Sure. It's interesting because there's two sides to this. I've now done this work for about a 10-year period. It's a little bit turnkey for me. So I come into an environment in many ways, kind of knowing what probably has to happen before I even take on the job. Having said that, at the same time, I'm not a subject matter expert in a lot of the niche nonprofit work that I've been doing. The first role that I took post graduate school was leading the turnaround of a digital divide organization in Oakland. The organization had been around for a 20-year period. It was founded by an amazing person who was a mid-level IBM executive who retired in his 50s and then spent the next 20 years building this organization in Oakland. And then he got incredibly sick, had cancer, and thought it was going to be terminal. and was not going to be able to continue to run the organization. And typical founder thing. Founders are the driving force behind many smaller nonprofits, certainly. And so we were connected. I was finishing up grad school. He talked about the challenges of the organization, him not being able to physically continue to do the work. And I remember that conversation. I said to him, look, I don't have a technology background. I'm not from Oakland. But some of the things that you're talking about, I feel I know very well. You're talking about, making sure the financial management is good, the fundraising, the marketing. Those are things I know. I've got to learn the technology piece, and, I've got to try to leverage you and others in that process. And it's a great story, not just because, the turnaround worked and the work scaled, but his cancer actually went into remission. And so he is still alive, fortunately, long since retired, and that work has grown and scaled. But I come into this work never assuming that I know everything. I typically have a blueprint of what I think needs to happen. But the people who do the direct service work, they know it better than I do. I've also done this work in college access, and now I'm doing it in elementary education. I don't know those particular things better. I know the general framework, but I always know that I have to continue to be of a mindset of listening and learning.
This episode of As Unexpected is sponsored in part by Semester C, a study abroad program for college students and adults on career breaks, sabbaticals, or retired, interested in learning and exploring the world together. Learn more about the Lifelong Learner program at www.semesterc.org. I love it. And if I can just play off that a little bit in my own professional trajectory, I certainly know that, or I believe, let me say it that way, I believe that today at 57 years old, I'm a much better listener than I was at 27. And to your point, you bring a foundation of experience that allows you to look at situations in a more comprehensive, with breadth and depth, that I wasn't able to do when I was 27. So I totally get what you're saying.
And if I would add to that, if I could, I know that you're a parent. And clearly being a parent has taught you lots of patience.
Yeah, parenting is, I just had our oldest son just graduated from high school, is going on to college, wants to play soccer. And of course, you figure you've been doing this for 18 years. We got this figured out. And we don't. Every day is a new lesson. And I think, and there's wisdom, as you've explained very well, that we get a sense of how to show up. We get a sense of the framework, the word you use, the framework. And then new information comes in, if we're good listeners, and we figure out what to do with that new information that can be, in fact, quite unexpected, even now.
Sure.
There's no question about it.
We can talk about it offline.
Exactly. So you've used a couple key words that actually play into a book that, sometimes I pull off the shelf. There's a lot in it for me personally, even though, it's not necessarily the context as you described. It's not the context that either of us have worked in necessarily, but there's some power in the words. And so if you don't mind, particularly in the spirit of your current work around reading and the power of reading regardless of age, I'd like to share with you a few sentences from the book by Stephen Snyder. The book is called Leadership and the Art of Struggle: How Great Leaders Grow Through Challenge and Adversity. So here's on page 15, Stephen Snyder writes, instead of denying struggle or feeling some degree of shame, savvy leaders embrace struggle as an opportunity for growth and learning, as an art to be mastered. They come to see struggle as a universal rite of passage without allowing themselves to become mired in it. So I've got those few sentences highlighted in this book because every once in a while I want to go to that, and I wanted to share them with you and get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with that. It's obvious that that applies for my work because I lead organizations through change. All leaders, if they're around long enough, go through some significant change. I know you certainly are leading the charge very much with some very important work to me personally, and thank you for what you do for SAS. I heard a similar quote recently. I wish I had thought of this quote myself, but this gentleman shared it at a conference a week or so ago, which was, be disruptive without causing chaos. And so, and I bring it up because I think, what you just read in that is very similar in a lot of fashions, that there's a requirement as a leader, yes, to be humble, yes, to listen, and to be able to pivot. And if you lead long enough, which typically does not have to be long for most organizations, you should expect that there are going to be challenges. And it's really a great opportunity for people to find the humanity in the work that they do, I think, in any field, and that connection, again, that can really drive people forward.
Disruption without chaos. I love it. I love that.
I wish I had thought of it. It was a guy named Jason McAlpine. He's in the private sector. I've always sort of thought that, and it was so eloquent with the way he said it. I wish I had said it, but I want to give him his props.
As we all should. Nonetheless, that's a great title for this podcast, Disruption Without Chaos. I love it. I mean, it's just a powerful way to frame it. One of the things we try to do here, and that I really try to show up for our team, is setting long-term aspirational goals that stretch the organization beyond what oftentimes we believe to be possible, but they have to be achievable at the same time. So there's this fine balance, right, between true aspiration and the unbelievability. And there's some line there that we all have to draw for an organization, for ourselves, for a team. And clearly, when you are working with an organization to turn it around, you have to set something that is aspirational, that perhaps the people you're showing up with day to day didn't envision possible. Could you share some of the work you've done recently with your organization, to the reading team, that is setting it on a course for perhaps an aspirational future that maybe prior to you showing up didn't seem in their lens, in their view?
Yeah. This will be a little bit of how the sausage is made.
That's perfect. I love it.
I'm all about transparency, so I think it's okay. The reading team has existed for 22 years. It was founded by a woman, Maureen Rover, who had retired from the publishing industry. She was fortunate to have been very well off. She came from a fairly humble background. And at some point in the 90s, she saw a news story that talked about the state of education in the city and how bad it was. And she said to her husband, someone should do something about that. It's unacceptable. And her husband said, why don't you stop talking about it and actually do something? And she said, you know what, I will. And so that started this organization. She ran it for 15, 16 years, something along those lines. She was great, amazing, a force of will. I've now been with the organization a little under a year. And we have a great, amazing board of directors. And I try not to say but.
I'm with you.
And there's still a need for them to learn more about what it is to run it. They're not there every day on the ground level. They're smart people, but they haven't had the experiences that I've had. I've run this organization, that organization. And so one of the things that I had to do pretty early on into joining the organization was to talk about, this is what we're doing great. And this is what best practice is. And there's some space between those things. And so, how do we move closer to being in line and bringing those things together? And so, some of it looks like for us specifically as an organization is, how do we change our model? So tangible example, we have a space in Central Harlem. We have, for our after school program, we have kids coming from all different schools, and they're dropped off at this one location. We pay a ton of money for this place because it's Central Harlem. It's New York City.
Yeah, of course.
So the short of it is we pay $200,000 a year for this space, but we use the space 3 hours a day and only during the school year. And so one of the things I said pretty early on was, we got to move. And so that's, I would rather spend that level of money having more staff, serving more children, than a space that we use a fraction of the day, only 10 months a year. And it was a hard thing for our board to understand. And, I kept drilling it in them, and we eventually moved on. And so we're in the end stages of that right now, breaking the lease and all this stuff. But, that's part of my work is around trying to teach other people who are partners, especially board members. Board members, I'm sure you agree with this. Board members are your greatest stewards, your greatest volunteers.
For sure.
And my board, like many boards, there's really smart people. And if I can share with them what I know, take it out of my brain and give it to them, I think that people will often make the same types of decisions and recommendations that I make. And so a lot of my work is about, training and sharing to bring those things together.
Thank you so much, Charon. That's awesome. Love the perspective, the insights. I'd love to close this up by asking you one last request. If you could share one piece of advice with our listeners as they move forward in their leadership practice, what would that piece of advice be?
Okay. So I feel that I can't end this conversation without having to talk about semester at sea. I grew up in Harlem in the 80s and the early 90s before the city had really turned around. And, I was fortunate, again, very active parents. They put me in independent schools. But my neighborhood was pretty rough. And I kind of, when I went to college, I kind of thought I had seen it all. And I did semester at sea. And it was such a wake-up call. I remember in particular, we were in India. We were in New Delhi, Bombay. And, you just recognize, poverty, for example, is radically different in other countries. You think it's really bad in the U.S. It is nothing in comparison to other places. And that experience, for me personally, and I think true for everybody else who was on my voyage, taught me a level of humility and perspective, world perspective, that I did not have prior to that experience. And so that's not necessarily a professional example, but I do think that bringing that to the table in the work that we do is how we can be better, not only better human beings, but better leaders and better managers. And so that is what I would want to leave people with in this conversation.
So if I could just capture it, make sure you get a global perspective that brings your humility and sense of purpose to crystallization as you move forward in your career. I mean, that kind of perspective is so powerful, so powerful. Charon, thank you so much for the time today. It's a pleasure to speak with you again, and hopefully we'll get a chance to have coffee again in New York City. Of course, if you ever find your way to Colorado, let me know.
I would love to do that.
All right. You be well. Thanks so much.
You too. Take care.
This episode of As Unexpected is sponsored in part by Semester at Sea, a study abroad program where students visit 10 countries on 3 continents, all while taking 3 to 4 college classes through Colorado State University. See course offerings and upcoming voyage itineraries at www.semesteratsea.org. Thank you for joining this week's episode of the As Unexpected podcast. The viewpoints and opinions of featured guests do not necessarily represent those of the Institute for Shipboard Education or Semester at Sea. Hit the like button, share it with your colleagues, family, and friends, and remember, be curious, be compassionate, be courageous. That's what it takes to lead as unexpected.